In this lecture, we'll learn about the Tooltip component. You can easily add tooltips to links and buttons with different options for custom HTML, position, animation, delay, triggers, and offsets. Tooltips can be added to links and buttons in the same way and will also appear in the same way. Let's make one of each and see it demonstrated. We will create an anchor tag with an empty href attribute and the text tooltip for link. Now we need to add the data toggle attribute with the value tooltip and the title attribute with the value tooltip on top. The value of the title attribute will act as the label for the tooltip, and it must have a value for the tooltip to be displayed. Now we'll create a button tag with the type button and the classes btn and btn primary. We'll give it the text tooltip for button. As we did before, we'll now add the data toggle attribute with the value tooltip and the title attribute with the value tooltip on top. Before we can see this in the browser, we need to initialize it with JavaScript and jQuery. To do this, we will attach the tooltip handler to our tooltip elements. As our jQuery selector, we will use the attribute selector and select all elements with the attribute data toggle and the corresponding value tooltip. Now let's see this in action. When we hover either of the elements, we will see the tooltip appearing with the title attribute as the tooltip label. Let's look at the different variations of the tooltip component. We can use custom HTML for our tooltip by adding the attribute data HTML with the value true. Let's copy the code for the button with the default tooltip. Change the text to tooltip with custom HTML and add this attribute. Now we just need to create some HTML content as the value of the title attribute. Let's use the strong tag. The small tag, create a primary badge component, and use the M tag. Remember to use single quotes for any attribute values for your custom HTML, since this is placed inside another pair of double quotes. Let's take a look in the browser. Now we can see our custom HTML appearing when we hover the button. We can change the default position of a tooltip by adding the attribute data placement with one of the 4 values. top, right, bottom, and left. Let's duplicate the code for the button with the default tooltip and then add this attribute with the value top and change the text to tooltip on top. Let's copy this 3 times and then change the value of the attribute as well as the text of each button accordingly. Let's take a look in the browser. Now we can see our tooltip appearing in each of the different positions when we hover the buttons. We can disable the default animation of a tooltip by adding the attribute data animation with the value false. We will duplicate the code for the button with the default tooltip add this attribute and change the text. Let's take a look in the browser. Now we can see our tooltip appearing without any animation when we hover the button. We can add a delay for showing and hiding a tooltip by adding the attribute data delay with the delay time in milliseconds as the value. We'll duplicate the code for the button with the default tooltip, add this attribute with the value 500 and change the text. Let's take a look in the browser. Now we can see our tooltip appearing and disappearing with a delay when we hover the button. We can change the default trigger action for showing and hiding a tooltip by adding the attribute data trigger with one or more of the following keywords as the value. Click, hover, focus, manual. The first 3 values can be combined by separating them with a space. We will duplicate the code for the button with the default tooltip, add this attribute with the value click, and change the text. Let's take a look in the browser. Now we can see our tooltip appearing and disappearing only when we click the button. Finally, we can add an offset relative to the position of a tooltip by adding the attribute data offset with a value with the following syntax: vertical offset, space, horizontal offset. The offset values can be written in pixels or percentages and can be either positive or negative. We'll duplicate the code for the button with the default tooltip twice. The first button will get a vertical offset with the value of the attribute being 50%, space, 0, and the text tooltip with vertical offset. The second button will get a horizontal offset with the value of the attribute being 0, space, minus 50%, and the text tooltip with horizontal offset. Let's take a look in the browser. Now we can see our tooltip appearing with a vertical or horizontal offset respectively when we hover the buttons. We have now learned how to use the tooltip component to easily add tooltips to links and buttons with different options for position, animation, delay, triggers, and offsets. Go on and continue with the coding exercises, which will help you learn the correct structure for this component.